Slavery in the South does not exist as some sort of monolithic type of institution. It's going to differ. It's going to vary between the Upper South and the Lower South, and it's also going to vary between the rural slavery and urban slavery. Basically, slavery on the outskirts and in the countryside, and versus the cities. So let's talk about slavery, particularly the slaveholding class. The planter class is traditionally believed to be 20 or more slaves, those who own 20 or more slaves. And most likely, many of the slave owners are not going to, of these types of people, are not going to be living in the plantations themselves. They're going to be living in cities. Like if you go down St. Charles Street in New Orleans, you can actually see a bunch of houses, very nice looking houses. These are going to be basically owned by the slave owners that are around New Orleans. Because they typically didn't live on their slave plantations. Basically what they would do is they would show up occasionally on their plantations and see what's going on, but they would leave the day-to-day operation of the plantation to what's known as the overseer. And the overseer was the person who basically got all the labor accomplished from the slaves. That he would discipline the slaves. He would make sure the slaves were working at a satisfactory level. Therefore, the overseer is typically one of the most villainous of all of the slave regimes when it came to the North. The North vilified him. In fact, if you were to read the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, the owner of the slave is not the villain. It's going to be his overseer. The person who ultimately kills him is the overseer. But nonetheless, you're going to have a person that's going to run the plantations on behalf of the owner. Now, there's going to be a school of thought back in the olden days that said that slavery was not profitable. Generally, this is going to be what we call the lost cause school, trying to justify what the South has been doing. And they said that slavery was it was impractical, it was paternalistic, and it wasn't profitable. Well, after World War II, you start to see a change in the interpretation of it. Is slavery being unprofitable? That's a rather interesting thing to do. Imagine if you were doing something for 200 years that consistently lost money. Would you be doing it still? I wouldn't even be doing it for 200 minutes or 200 days if I were trying to do something that's constantly losing money rather than 200 years. No, the slavery was a profitable institution, and the average gain from a slave is about 10%. And the profitability of the slavery is going to rest on the demand for worldwide cotton. Demand every year in the first half of the 19th century, demand for cotton is going to go up by 5% every single year. Between 1850 and 1860, the average price of a male field hand, is going to go up from $250 to $900 per slave. So why would this happen? Well, the demand for slaves is going to be greater. The abolition of the international slave trade meant that slavery was growing at a natural rate. And so if you needed more slaves, you're going to have to pay more money rather than get them off the slave ships. The rise in price meant that owners could sell slaves and realize a profit above what they can get from their labor. And slave women, particularly those of childbearing years, are going to nearly match the amount of money a male field hand is going to be worth to a slave owner. Now, this does not mean that there's going to be slave breeding. No matter how many times the historical community has tried to find slave breeding pens, we cannot find them. They're not going to be bred like dogs or pets. They're going to, slavery, when it comes to having children, it's going to be done through a natural increase with slave marriages and relationships between the slaves themselves, rather than some sort of puppy mill type of thing going on. The South is not as urbanized as the North is, and so we are going to see a definite difference when it comes to slavery out in the outskirts versus slavery in the cities. Slavery on the outskirts and in the countryside, that's typically what we think about when we talk about slavery, the plantations. They're going to be working out in the fields. Whereas with the urban slaves, it's a little bit different. Urban slaves can, especially if they have a skill, they actually are going to enjoy a little bit more freedoms than their rural counterparts. For example, if you're a carpenter, you can go and you can sell your services out to somebody in the city. You'll get a portion of that money and you can save it, but the vast majority of the money is going to go actually to the slave owner to compensate for their losses. In addition to the differences between rural and urban slavery, you're going to see the differences in Upper South and Lower South slavery. The Upper South, those states, basically Virginia, North Carolina, and along that line of longitude, it's going to be almost abandoning slavery by the time we get to the Civil War. We're starting to see a decrease in the slave population by 10% every decade, and mainly because that 10% is actually going down to the Lower South. In the Upper South, the reason why slavery is not as prevalent is because of the fact that you have crops that don't require as much labor. For example, tobacco, wheat, grains, and fodder. All of these are not going to be as labor intensive as, say, the unholy trinity, as I call them, of cotton, rice, and sugar. And so, these are less work intensive, which does not require constant attention, with the exception of tobacco. As farmers are abandoning tobacco, they're keeping fewer slaves and rely more on cheap seasonal labor than slave labor. And of course, the Lower South is a different story. The Lower South constantly needs slavery because they're producing that unholy trinity of cotton, sugar, and rice. They constantly need a large amount of labor, and therefore they need to have slaves. So the slave population in the Lower South is growing at an enormous rate because of the fact that they are growing cotton. So slave populations are going to grow through two sources: natural increase and migration from the Upper South into the Lower South.